Welcome, Dr. Neimeyer, and I hope you don't mind if I call you Bob.
I hope you will call me Bob.
Thank you.
Call you Amanda.
That'd be great. Thank you. So I want to welcome you to the Life After Loss podcast, and we feel very, very privileged to have you on the podcast to share both your academic knowledge and also your lived experience to an Australian audience. Your research into meaning reconstruction in bereavement is revered by grief and loss practitioners the world over, as is a lot of your research. But perhaps you could explain this theory to our listeners whose knowledge of grief generally comes from a lived experience.
Well, of course, that makes them the true experts, doesn't it? It's when we ourselves suffer the rigors of a tragic loss that we come to know what grief is. And we come to recognize what it isn't, that it's not some simplistic movement through predefined stages of adaptation. It's a much more elemental experience, much more visceral, much more often tumultuous, emotional, incomprehensible. We're trying to make sense of what we've been through, and we're trying to make sense of who we are in light of it. So with that in mind, I try to understand grieving as a process of meaning making. And what I mean by that is understanding that a core aspect of grieving has to do with reaffirming or rebuilding a world of meaning that has been challenged by loss, shaken, sometimes shattered by it. So that's the frame with which we're generally operating, to understand it as an existential passage through a universal experience of loss that will touch all of us, typically multiple times in the course of our lives, sometimes lightly, sometimes much more aggressively. And so if those listeners who have been through difficult losses are tuning in, I would simply want to honor their humanity, to recognize the considerable difficulties that such grief can introduce into our lives. And urge them to take in the helpful and healing messages that you offer with Griefline.
Thank you, Bob. What's been happening lately is with the floods that they've been affecting so many Australians. It's caused a lot of trauma, and there's the loss of homes, livelihoods, and of course people have lost loved ones. But at the same time, these people have experienced very traumatic situations, perhaps being airlifted to safety, their homes filling with water in a matter of moments, being swept away, all those sorts of really traumatic experiences, as well as the loss that they've experienced. So I'm just wondering, we hear a lot about PTSD in situations like this, but do you see a connection between grief and trauma that we don't sort of hear a lot about?
No, we don't hear enough about it, particularly in cases like this where people are standing at the conjunction of exactly these two things. Their world has been traumatically taken from them. And so we have that element of just an eruption of something incomprehensible, uncontrollable, far beyond our ability to manage. That is the very definition of trauma. And we also have the loss of that which we once held, sometimes the person we once held, sometimes the home, the business, the city we once inhabited. I had the experience of visiting Brisbane on many occasions, both before and after the 2011 floods, and I could see the residual damage done to the city and to many of its inhabitants. It is a horrific kind of experience. I have not lost a home or loved ones in a flood. I have witnessed the decimation of my sister's life following the house fire that leveled her home, collapsed it into the basement, and she lost every possession that had meaning for her sentimentally, economically. She lost an entire life, and bravely, like many survivors of tragic loss, has rebuilt to the extent that she can do so. but not on that site and not in that state. So in a personal way within my family, as well as in a professional way, working alongside many clients whose lives have been literally flooded with trauma or razed to the ground by bushfires, be it in Australia or in the United States. They closely threatened my own home in Portland, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest of this country last year. I have a sense of empathy that rises in me in relation to these losses. And I'd be happy to talk about some of what they entail.
Absolutely, we'd be very interested in that for sure, and because I think what we're finding, particularly with the people that we're talking to on this episode, is they experienced the trauma of the 2011 floods, which you've just mentioned, and they were told at the time it's a 1 in 100 flood, and so they were managed to, I guess, hold on to some hope, and that may have been what was one of the ways they were able to sort of reclaim their lives. But then, of course, it's happened again. So that, I guess that hope's been dashed, and they're sort of a little bit bereft of hope at the moment. So there's that re-traumatisation, and I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on where do they go from here?
It, of course, is it's a difficult question, and I suppose the simple answer to the complex question is that they go back to square one. That is, on the game board of life, they kind of go back to the point of origin, and they probably need to ask the kinds of questions that all of us, when we experience a traumatic loss, whether it's through bereavement, whether it's of property, home, sometimes confront. And this is the loss of what we might consider our assumptive world. That is, that whole groundwork of assumptions that we count on in order to get through breakfast each day. The assumption that life is in some measure predictable, that there is such a principle in the universe as justice, that we can have some level of control or agency in determining the course of our lives, that we can protect others we love from grave injury or harm, and that the future will be something that we can imagine and work toward, live toward. But when we experience something like the Queensland floods, or the Australian bushfires, or their counterparts in my beleaguered country, all of those assumptions of how the world is or should be are lost right along with our property, right along with the lives that we thought we were leading. If our lives were a book, a storybook, it's as if all the future chapters from this point forward have been torn out and they have to be rewritten. Sometimes in a whole different setting, sometimes with a whole different cast of characters. And we will rarely find ourselves simply resuming the life we once had. We are forever changed by such events. And when it happens not once, but twice or more, then of course we are reminded of the reality of randomness in the universe. In my country, which tends to be more religiously inclined than your own more secular society, many people have to question their spiritual foundations if they believed prior in a God who somehow would help them through adversity or protect those who were, had merit in their lives. And they find that they have to ask questions about what is the intention of God, or in a secular sense, what kind of universe do we live in? How do I learn to live with utter randomness, right, at this scale of magnitude? And of course, when all of this is then overlaid with a global pandemic, for not 1 year, not 2 years, but more going forward, then the sense of human impotence in the face of climate change and all the chaos it engenders, in the face of uncontrollable diseases and wars. Even though Australia has done a very good job in managing COVID compared to many nations, we are certainly reminded of the limits of our own agency and freedom. So I suppose part of what this calls us to is a deep review of what does have meaning in life, and what meaning do we want this tragedy to have in the larger scheme of our lives? How can we work toward finding some adaptive significance in it?
That's and that metaphor of the book and ripping out the pages is just so strong. But I guess, as you say, it can be rewritten. So there is an element of hope there. But it sounds like for these people that a lot of them are exhausted, and I can imagine having to rewrite the whole book could be quite overwhelming.
I don't doubt it at all. And I suppose the first call is the call to compassion for others affected by the same disaster, and a call to self-compassion for what we ourselves need at a time that we need tending, befriending. We need a sense of safety to once again construct a secure base for our lives, however provisional it is. We have to ask ourselves, and in some sense ask our hearts and our guts, what now do I need? How today can I take one step concretely in that direction? To whom can I turn? What internal resources might I draw on as I begin this long work of reconstructing a life made alien by this catastrophic loss? And as tragic as the circumstance is, in Queensland in this case, of course, there is no shortage of examples of others having to deal with the same thing, whether it's the nightmare of Fukushima following the tsunami and the nuclear reactor destruction, whether it's the people of Ukraine as they flee the mass slaughter in that country, or the 100 other circumstances in which people are experiencing wide-scale tragic loss now. Sadly, it is part of the human condition. That doesn't make it easier to bear.
No, and I really appreciate you referencing all of that's going on in the world at the moment, and it is really quite overwhelming for us all. But as you say, we are united in our humanity, and certainly from a Griefline point of view, our volunteers, they give their lives to compassion. So we're very grateful for them for that. In terms of what we're seeing with the survivors of the current floods, is there's a lot of anger. There seems to be a lot of anger, certainly projected towards the authorities. And we know that anger is a part of grief. I guess what I'm asking is, why is this anger? Do you think this anger is just so volatile at the moment? And can it be helpful? Do we need to be concerned about it? What do we need to do in the face of this anger?
I don't want to pretend to greater expertise about the circumstances of your listeners than I have. They will know the sources of their own anger, their own rage, their own bitterness better than I ever could hope to from my distant perch. What I can say is that in general terms, I understand anger as an understandable human response to the violation of boundaries. And the effort, in some sense, psychologically, to reassert those boundaries over against something that is threatening, aggressive, overwhelming. Now, in the face of something like this, that is an act of nature, nonetheless, there may be human beings who bear partial responsibility for the widespread damage. Perhaps flood control measures were not implemented in a timely and comprehensive way. Perhaps shortcuts were made in the repair or the rerouting of river systems. I'm not sure about all of those matters of economics and engineering, There may be ample cause for us to feel hard done by, unfairly treated, not protected by those who had a duty to protect. I simply can't speak to those issues of the justice or injustice involved. But what I can do is just understand that anger is a protective emotion. It's a commonplace one. And one of the things that it can protect us from are more vulnerable emotions, such as grief, that might reside beneath the kind of shell of anger. In some sense, the anger as a powerful secondary emotion at least energizes us.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be tempting to maintain that stance almost as a way of also protecting us in some measure from this sense of utter helplessness and grief and vulnerability that lies beneath it. So when I face in my own life or in the life of my clients as I work in a psychotherapeutic way, I always try to hear the call of different emotions in the same person. Rarely are we so simple as to have a single feeling. Almost always, we are a complex chorus of voices, each of which has a part to sing in our personal choirs. And so I might ask in such a case, what does the angry part of you need? Maybe the answer would be, it needs justice, or it demands protection, or it calls for solidarity. And then I would say, and what does that vulnerable, grieving part of you need? It needs consolation. It needs safety. It needs understanding and, maybe being brought back into a circle of care. So I see all emotions as potentially adaptive. They are ways of signaling to us what we require in order to cope with, in this case, very grave adversity. And I only, would suggest that we listen to our whole heart and not only the loudest part of it.
I wondered if we could discuss prolonged grief disorder, which is sometimes known as complicated grief, sometimes even complex grief. And we know, for example, the people of Grantham, Queensland, who we're working with in this podcast, that they survived 2011. And most of the people of that community have been able to get on with their lives. But there is a section that have not been able to. And I'm wondering if you can explain how you think prolonged grief disorder might be playing a part here.
I'd be happy to do so. And in fact, I just published a little essay on that today,
right,
on the Facebook page for the Portland Institute.
Okay.
So if any of your readers would like to have a kind of possibly more detailed response to your excellent question, they might look there. Just look for the Portland Institute Facebook page and you'll see today's posting. This is in response to, as you probably know, the announcement by the American Psychiatric Association, just a few days ago, of the formal inclusion of prolonged grief disorder in the DSM-5-TR, the Bible of the American Psychiatric Association, echoing and elaborating the similar inclusion of prolonged grief disorder in the International Classification of Disease, the 11th edition, by the World Health Organization a couple of years ago. So both American psychiatry and world psychiatry have in some sense shaken hands in relation to this after a great deal of reluctance, decades of reluctance to include it. Mm-hmm. And the reluctance was based probably on several concerns, one of which was not wanting to pathologize an ordinary human experience. And this is certainly a concern shared by a number of the bereaved, and especially advocates for the bereaved, especially lay people who are supporters of those who are bereaved. But the maybe less noble motivation of psychiatry might be that it may have had some reluctance to relinquish the exclusive relevance of other existing diagnoses like depression or anxiety states or PTSD as adequate descriptors of people's experiencing grief. I think what we've found, though, is that as research has been done in so very many contexts, including wonderful research in Australia, it's become very clear to a point that it's hard to ignore that 5 to 10% of people who have experienced at least a bereavement, the loss of a significant loved one or attachment figure to death, 5 to 10% of them may not find that time heals all wounds. They may not find that their own sources of internal resilience or the support of their families or communities or cultures are sufficient to help them find new footing in a world made strange by the loss that they have suffered. And so, in the description of the American Psychiatric Association, when we find that a year or more following our loss, it's almost as if we're in the first week or month of adaptation to it. There's essentially no visible change, no tangible change. The criteria would include having our relationships, our ability to function as parents to our children, as partners to a spouse, to function in the workplace, to maintain social relations, close friendships. All of these may wither away or promptly be suspended to a degree that we simply can't function in those roles in the way that we need to. Nor can we find a way to deal with the kind of heaving sea of emotion, and particularly that deep sense of yearning for what eternity will not return, at least in a living physical sense, and that is the one we have lost. We may also find a great deal of preoccupation with the circumstances of the death, such as the traumatic story by which they were taken from us. And we may find that we struggle with intrusive imagery around that, a kind of constant rumination about the injustice of it. And often a preoccupation with what I would call the backstory of our relationships to the one who had died, not being able to be there for them, not being able perhaps to resolve issues in our relationship that have troubled us for a long time. Having to live with those silent and unsatisfying stories that now we'll never have a chance to make right, the unresolved conflict, the unfulfilled wishes in that relationship. And it seems as if death places a kind of boundary on that where we're unable now to imagine a way beyond this unfinished business that we're beset with. So all of that and more is what's packed into this diagnosis. And I think we can be concerned about pathologizing normal human grief. Grief is a very natural and very adaptive response to loss, except when it isn't, except when no adaptation takes place. And we find ourselves, to cite a personal example, lived experience, my father's death by suicide when I was an 11-year-old boy, the eldest of 3 kids, leaving my mother with 3 little characters to raise. I immediately was promoted to being the little man in the family, however unready I was for that. And really for the rest of her life, my mother, I think, struggled with a very complicated grief, multiple attempts at suicide, substantial alcoholism, and a silent, self-isolating story that she felt she could share with no others. And so in that way, I have some firsthand experience of a complicated, protracted, prolonged grief that does not yield to the passage of time or the best attempts of others to to support her. Certainly, the marginal support that could be provided by her 3 young children was not enough to help my mother through and beyond that. So it's in that sense that I think it's important to recognize that grief is a serious enough issue that for a small subset of the bereaved, we have to look at the ways that it can go tragically wrong, where people can become stuck in an interminable diagnosis. Life doesn't get any better. And indeed, the losses are compounded then as other vital relationships and life purposes may wither away in the presence of grief of that sort. It goes beyond what can be explained in terms of depression, even at the level of our neurocircuitry. There are very important differences between grief and conventional anxiety states and states of depression or mood disorder. There's something more and something special about the brokenheartedness of grief, the rupture in that loving bond. And so it is, I think, the need to find a way forward that honors the bond, that rebuilds the sense of connection or attachment with the deceased in a way that is sustainable now. This is, I think, an important road through and beyond that frozen sense of prolonged anguish. This doesn't mean that we're ever going to be simply at peace or happy over the loss of our child, our partner, our loved one. Of course not. But does it mean that nothing else in our lives will have value or meaning? I hope that wouldn't be the case. So prolonged grief disorder is psychiatry's attempt to recognize those hard realities of existence. It's not the only way of thinking about it. In a religious sense, we could call the experience of complicated grief a dark night of the soul. From a standpoint of being a constructivist psychologist, I might describe it as a crisis of meaning. We could describe it as a rupture or breakdown in the social system or the family system. We could describe it as a neurobiological event. All of these would be explanations that would describe part of the experience. None of them describe all of it, because we are more than psychology, psychiatry, and even religion can adequately describe, much less neurology. We're complex beings, and we have many different aspects.
It's well, firstly, I just wanted to say that our hearts are with you on the death of your father and what your mother went through. And thank you for sharing with us. I wonder if in your work with people that are experiencing something so desperately difficult, have you found that there have been individuals that have been able to work through this prolonged grief disorder and somehow integrate it into their lives and grow around their grief?
Certainly that's true. I have been inspired by countless individuals who have done just that. In fact, I would even say that there are few events in life more powerful than these kinds of tragic losses to inspire our growth as human beings, our growth in the capacity to feel compassion for the suffering of others and to act on that. So that if you were to look at the plenitude of charities that develop in your country, my own, or elsewhere on the planet, we would find an enormous percentage of them are launched in order to honor a loved one who has died. People are moved into action and advocacy by their suffering. The good work of those who provide bereavement care, especially to people who have suffered especially tragic loss, the death of a child, the death of someone to suicide, or in a more violent country than yours, homicide or natural disaster. almost all of these impulses arise in relation to our own suffering as we seek to find meaning in its aftermath. So I regard this as essentially a noble quest to not only reclaim our own lives, that's essential because we certainly can't help others if we forfeited our own, but not to limit it to that. And people who show not merely post-traumatic stress, but post-traumatic growth in terms of a deepening of their philosophical or spiritual grounding, in terms of opening up their hearts of empathy toward the suffering of others, in terms of taking on a sense of personal strength and resilience and purpose. These all are tangible responses to surmounting this kind of experience of devastation, valuing life, not despite its imperfection and fragility, but indeed because of it. It is all the more worth, holding and cultivating and cherishing while we have it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure that that's going to be very meaningful to a lot of people. Another way to sort of term some of what you talked about is that legacy making in some ways. And we certainly at Griefline, we talk about legacy making, continuing bonds as some of the therapeutic coping strategies and ways of grief integration. And in fact, one of the most popular resources on our website is an article called Coping with Grief. And that incorporates a number of coping strategies from your book, Techniques of Grief Therapy. So we're very grateful for that. Thank you. I just wondered if you might be able to touch on some of the ways that we might be able to work with people on our helpline, on our forums, when they're asking for coping strategies, something more than what we've discussed so far.
Certainly there are as many ways of coping constructively with grief and loss as imagination can contrive. I can touch on a few, but I think that the creativity of your listeners will greatly exceed any advice that I can give. I'm sure you can have some inspiring stories shared directly by those who are, taking action in their own lives and that of others. One thing is that to recognize that especially that kind of sticky grief that we easily get mired in thrives on rumination, on the kind of single-minded going over and over and over again, maybe the tragic circumstances of the dying or the incomplete dialogues or connections in the context of our own unfinished business with the bereaved. And the mind becomes like a dog running in circles, chasing its own tail. It's hard to explore farther afield when we're in that place. So anything that opens us to novelty, that grounds us in present moment experiencing, as opposed to a ruminative or obsessive preoccupation with the past. Anything that essentially dilates our field of vision, so we begin to take in more of what is there to be seen around us, including the people who are there to be seen around us, will serve us well in helping us revise a world that has been maybe tattered by loss. Mindfulness training can be an aid in this. Various forms of practice of yoga can again help us give attention to our grieving bodies and also ultimately to compassionately observe our own thoughts and feelings without locking into them and holding onto them with white knuckles. So the ability to acknowledge what is there for us, including our pain, with compassion, and then allow it to flow, and for other things to come into our awareness, to appreciate the taste of this fruit that we have in our breakfast cereal, right? Or this sea breeze and salt air as we walk along the coast, right? Or the smell of these gum trees as we stroll through a forest, right? Or have a fine meal at a restaurant in Melbourne. You know, all of these things that invite us back into a world that still has beauty, that still has flavor, that still beckons to us. And then anything that engages our own creativity, that helps us see that we are not merely a shell of who we once were, but there is still some spark within us that is looking for tinder, wanting to catch fire, to have something that matters to us, someone who matters to us, that allows us to move toward something of value in the future, not only to hold the cold loyalty with that which was and can't be again in the physical sense in which we wish it could be. I often find it helpful to think myself and to speak with my clients about the idea of a continuing bond. Of course, most of us, when we lose someone we love greatly, even if they were imperfect, we hope to hold them in our hearts going forward. We don't want to leave them behind. The goal of grieving is not relinquishment of a relationship, it's reinvention of it in a form that's sustainable now. And so I often find it helpful to ask, what kind of heart do you want your lover to live in? Is it one that's dark and closed? Is it one that is knee-deep in a kind of acidic bitterness? Right? Or is it one that is filled with light and hope, novelty, beauty, and gratitude? Right? You know, what's the aesthetics of that heart that you want them to live in? What kind of life do you want to rebuild and take them along with you into? Now, none of that is meant to be dismissive of the very real pain of very real losses. But it is the kind of challenge I think being faced by millions of Ukrainians now, and maybe hundreds or thousands of Australians now. It's and of course one could expand those comparisons endlessly in a world that's filled with suffering. This is in some sense the nature of the existential struggle of being human. And I think there's reason to be inspired by how people can engage those kinds of difficult challenges.
And we do see that on our forums at Griefline and just even with the helpline, we do see this growth in certain individuals and who are open themselves up to so many the beauty, I guess, that's around us and amongst the sadness, and we do find that I guess the support of other people seems to be one of the most the best tools that people can use. And you did mention that opening yourself up to other people. So I would imagine that a support network is something that you would promote as well.
Another thing that was hinted at by your comment about the legacy work that you promote so beautifully is the use of creative personal rituals that go beyond what our culture commonly provides. It may be that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia or the Maori of New Zealand had some eloquent ways of taking into account the reality of death and loss as a community. But in our secularized contemporary Western frame, we often have lost those rituals or thinned them out considerably. And so reinventing ways of ritualizing, acknowledging our losses, but weaving them into the broader tapestry of our lives, rather than having them be the torn fabric that ends the threads of connection, is something we're thinking about. And In the Portland Institute, we have actually coming up now in just a couple of weeks, a presentation by a hospice chaplain and a teacher in a theological, that kind of ecumenical theological seminary. Her name is Terry Daniel, and she's talking about and demonstrating and providing instruction in personal rituals grounded in a creative impulse that acknowledge who and what we have lost in a meaningful way. So, like you, we find ourselves wanting to draw on the immense reservoir of creativity to which people have access and to help give it shape and healing form.
It sounds like a fascinating seminar. I hope that we can get access to some of that in some way.
Yeah, well, check it out at portlandinstitute.org on the
We
on
will.
the web. Have you join us. So.
We would love to. Thank you so much. Well, Bob, it's been really quite profound speaking with you today, and I think that our listeners are going to find so much in what you say that's helpful and also resonates so deeply with their own experience. So I'm very, very grateful for you sharing both your wisdom and also your lived experience. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time.
Well, the pleasure is mine. If there's profundity in this hour, it's in the work that you are doing with Griefline to help reach people at a place and a time when they need it, and to remind them that the world still has a place for them and that they have an important place in that world. So thank you for allowing me to be part of the team for at least an hour or so.
Oh, you're always welcome to be part of the team, Bob. Thank you.
Okay.